Awesome, outstanding. Thank you, Sarah, and thank you to Getting Hired for having us out today. We are super pumped to chat with you guys. As Sarah said, my name is Michael Murray. I'm the Director of Employer Policy here at the Office of Disability Employment Policy, otherwise known as ODEP. I'm the only person that calls it ODEP, but if you're on the phone, you can do it too. At the U.S. Department of Labor, I'm joined by my colleague.
Hi, everyone. This is Melissa Turner. I'm a Senior Policy Advisor on the Employer Policy team, also at ODEP at the Department of Labor.
And you notice she didn't call it ODEP, but for all those at home, if you have the deep desire to say ODEP, you may do so. We are a non-regulatory entity at the U.S. Department of Labor. We promote policy and coordinate with employers and all levels of government to increase the workplace success for people with disabilities. Our mission is to develop and influence policies that increase the number and quality of employment opportunities for people with disabilities. I know I just read what was on the screen, but I feel like our mission is a powerful one. And our mission has a huge impact. For such a small agency, we really do have a huge impact that helps so many folks with disabilities, but also helps employers, and that's a little bit what I want to focus on today, is we work directly with employers and with employee associations to find the best practices that you are implementing on the ground to increase the employment of people with disabilities. We find those practices, we learn how they work, we do the research around them, and then we create tools based off of the great work that's being done by top leading employers and businesses throughout the country. We create tools that will help other businesses and other employers implement those strategies and those practices and those policies, ultimately so that we can increase the employment of people with disabilities. And I think that's hopefully what you will learn today. Is a little bit about a tool that we've created called the Mental Health Toolkit, focused on creating a mental health friendly workplace. So our agenda for today will start with the rationale of why we're hiring folks with psychiatric disabilities or mental health disabilities, the scope of who you're employing and who we're talking about here when we talk about psychiatric disabilities or mental health disabilities. And then we're going to talk about the strategies. We're going to talk about bringing your A game, the 4 A's of a mental health friendly workplace, and then we'll pause for some questions. So I'm going to jump in for just a minute and talk a little bit about our rationale. And I'm going to mention the 3 things that are on the screen. But before I jump into that, I want to engage you in 3 reasons that I see employers hire folks with disabilities, including those of us with psychiatric disabilities. 3 reasons that I see employers hire folks with disabilities. First reason is because they have to. There's some kind of law, some kind of requirement, some kind of executive order. Their boss comes to them and says, you have to hire people with disabilities. And so they do it. In my opinion, that's not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, I think that those civil rights laws, those requirements are really the foundation that we need to work from in order to build a disability inclusive environment inside of the workplace. But often what we see when employers stop at doing it just because they have to is that it's just not enough. It's got to be the foundation, but we want to take people to better reasoning, because often when there's nobody overseeing compliance, when you're not looking over it and saying you have to comply in this way, if you remove that compliance, it often leads to non-compliance. And so we have to help folks see that, yes, there's a compliance requirement, but we want them to see that there are other reasons to engage the disability community, which is the second reason that I see employers hire people with disabilities. You ready for this, Melissa?
I'm ready.
All right, let's do this. Second reason that I see employers hire folks with disabilities is because it's the right thing to do. We're an equal opportunity community. Anybody can join us at any time. It doesn't matter your race, your ethnicity, your socioeconomic status, who your daddy was, who your mommy was. You can become a person with a disability at any time. And the longer you live, the more likely you are to acquire a disability. It's a natural part of the human experience, nothing to be scared of. The more hair I lose, the more my knees hurt. And so we want to live by the golden rule. We want to treat others as we'd like to be treated, and therefore we're going to hire people with disabilities. I would say that that's also not a bad reason. I think it's got a little bit of heart behind it. It's that corporate social responsibility that I know so many of the businesses on the line have a real focus on it. And even when you're going out and you're doing recruiting, because I know we've got a lot of recruiters on the line, that's important to the folks you're recruiting, that you have a corporate social responsibility. But if you stop there, what could be a potential issue? Doing it just because it's the right thing to do. What we've seen is that when folks are only doing it because it's the right thing to do, it can sometimes lead to pity. Can sometimes lead to, well, I'm just hiring this really great person with a disability and we're just going to give them a job and they're going to do so great here. And you can hear from the tone of my voice, there's a little bit of patronizing there. There isn't a full realization that I'm bringing this person on, not out of some kind of charity, but for the third and best reason that I see employers hire folks with disabilities. I get so pumped about this one. It's because we believe that it leads to innovation, creativity, new ideas, new perspectives that ultimately lead to better outcomes, that lead to you being able to serve your customer better, that lead to all of us having a better community, better lives, when we include that diverse perspective that is in the disability community. To put it very simply, if I put a group of people in a room and they've all got the same background, the same way of viewing the world, the same way of doing things, and I give them a problem, how many solutions do they come up with? One. But if I get a diverse group of people with different backgrounds, different ways of viewing the world, different ways of doing things, and I give them a problem, that's when you see innovation. That's when you see creativity. You see the stuff that America's made of. And so when we talk about the inclusion of people with psychiatric disabilities and people with disabilities in general, we're doing it for some very practical reasons, because you need to fill vacancies, because it can help you meet hiring goals that are put forth by the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs here at the Department of Labor. But ultimately, it's because we believe that it's going to make you a better business. And I think when we start with that as the foundation, it changes our whole perspective on how we engage in the rest of the material that we're going to talk about today. I'll give a quick example of this, and then Melissa's also going to give us some examples. But how many folks on the call today know where text messaging came from? Where did text messaging come from? It was originally designed for deaf folks. Now, how many of us text message today, right? In fact, if I could see you, probably many of y'all are text messaging right now as I'm talking, and that's okay. Keep text messaging. It's innovation because we included the diverse perspective that was inside of the deaf community. Now, that was good for deaf folks, but it was also good for all the rest of us. But I think the important thing to realize as well is it was good for business. That innovation, if you ever got your Verizon bill before you had unlimited texting, it was very good for business. And so these kinds of innovations, both on small individual levels, but also on very large levels like what I just mentioned, happen because we find ways to include that diverse perspective that is inside of the disability community. And there's some great research about this, and I think Melissa's going to cover that.
I am. You don't have to just believe, Michael, that it is good for your business to hire people with disabilities. The firm Accenture, which is a professional services and consulting firm, and some of you may be familiar with this research. It came out late last year. They conducted a study, and what they found is that companies that embrace these best practices to employ and support more people with disabilities in their workforces have actually outperformed their peer group in terms of profitability of their businesses. We think this is really exciting. Earlier research had already told us that employees with disabilities offered some substantial business benefits. For example, increased innovation, improved productivity, and a better work environment. But the new research also reveals that these best-in-class companies that participate in something called the Disability Equality Index also are performing better financially than their peers. The report is called Getting to Equal, the Disability Inclusion Advantage, and it was written between Disability In, the American Association of People with Disabilities, and Accenture. And it shows that companies that are embracing best practices to employ and support more people with disabilities see higher revenue, net income, and economic profit margins. So we're really excited about that, and there's also an ample opportunity here to make change. People with disabilities, as everyone on the phone knows, continue to be underrepresented in corporate America. And the Bureau of Labor Statistics tells us that there's an untapped talent pool of 10.7 million people who, with the right training and environment, offer these unique talents and opportunities to grow the labor force diversity and enhance a corporate culture of inclusion and diversity. And so there's a huge talent pool available to you, and if you can figure out how to tap that talent pool and appropriately support folks in the workplace, you can also increase your profitability. Couple of examples of people with disabilities who work in all kinds of different fields, particularly mental health disabilities. Just last month, Andy Imperato, who is the Executive Director of the Association of University Centers on Disability, he authored a blog that sums up the benefits of ensuring a workplace inclusive of people with mental health conditions. In the blog post, he talks about how early in his career as an attorney, he learned to see his psychiatric disability as a positive differentiator, something that allowed him to bring a different perspective to the job than his colleagues did, much like what Michael was just talking about. Andy is a person with bipolar disorder, and prior to his current position, he has worked all over government in leadership roles in the nonprofit world, in the U.S. Senate, and so, he brings to bear a lot of different experiences kind of across a range of employment settings, and has been remarkably successful in all of those different settings. Even, he has bipolar disorder, and it helps him in some ways in the workplace. Some other folks, as you know, people with mental health conditions are working in all kinds of jobs and in all kinds of industries. So we are not solely in the disability advocacy world and disability policy world. For example, Kristen, who is the Assistant Director of Digital Services at the University of Missouri, Kansas City, has been really open about her experiences with depression, and she advocates for more awareness of it on behalf of others working in higher education administration. In addition to higher education, there's an example of a woman named Denise, who is a senior manager at CACI, which is spelled C-A-C-I, where she runs the company's Disabled Veterans Program. As a veteran herself, Denise was active duty Air Force for many years and today continues to serve via the reserves. She has PTSD and is really committed to helping others who do as well, especially in the workplace. In sum, people with disabilities and mental health disabilities are really just that, people. And like all people, they work in all sorts of jobs. And just like all people, when they're supported by their employers, they are much more effective at work. To the next one. So why should you foster a mental health friendly workplace? We know that 80% of employees who are treated for mental health conditions report improved levels of work efficacy and satisfaction. Beyond that, it's really cost effective to have a mental health friendly workplace. For example, when employees receive effective treatment for mental illnesses, the result is lower total medical costs for your business, increased productivity, reduced absenteeism, and decreased disability costs. The bottom line is that investing in a mentally health-friendly workplace is good for your business. So how many people are we actually talking about? What is the scope of people in the U.S. with a mental illness or a mental health disability? You'll notice we're using a lot of different terms interchangeably: psychiatric disability, mental health condition, mental health disability, mental illness. Feel free to use what works for you in your business. What we know is that based on the 2017 National Survey on Drug Use and Health, we know that 1 in 5 adults in the United States who participates in the labor force experiences mental illness in a given year. 1 in 5 is a lot. It's almost 20%. So you've got the actual data there, 43.8 million, 18.5%. So it's a lot of people. On top of that, 1 in 25 of these adults experiences a serious mental illness in a given year. And what that means is that it's a mental illness that substantially interferes with or limits one or more major life activities. So we're talking about a large group of individuals. However, you may be wondering what exactly we're talking about. What do we count, or what is considered to be a mental health condition? The ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, does not contain a laundry list of all disabilities, but instead uses this broad definition, and I am just going to read it for you. A person has a disability if he or she has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities, a record of such an impairment, or is regarded as having an impairment. So to get a little bit more granular, the ADA does not give you a laundry list. We're not going to either, but here are a few. Common mental health conditions include things that you've likely heard of, such as depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, and seasonal affective disorder. For employees, these mental health conditions are typically invisible, which can mean that you as the employer may be unaware of some of your employer's needs.
So what does this all mean? what this means, and you can look at these statistics in a lot of different ways, but what I want you to take away from this is that you're already employing people with mental health conditions. And the reality is many of you probably have psychiatric disabilities or have experienced some sort of mental health situation, whether it's depression or something along those lines. And the longer you live, the more likely you are to experience one of these conditions. And so when we look at this data, I think it's really important that we see it not as this is their problem, but that this is already a part of the fabric of the work that we're doing, and that we've got to find ways to engage this community because they are us. And what we've realized, there's some really interesting research out there that looks at something called like me bias that shows that if I look at this data and say, well, that's those people, it's the other, then I'm less likely to engage them in a positive manner. Whereas if I see these statistics and I go, this means that we are all included inside of this, that people with psychiatric disabilities are already in our workplace and need to be included, and that we've got to find a way to do it, then you're more likely to take action in a positive way. So I hope that everyone on the call sees this data and realizes that this data means not to be scared, but to embrace it. And so as part of that, we have worked with to create a mental health toolkit that would be useful to businesses and really support you in fostering this mental health friendly workplace and a mental health friendly work culture. And what you're going to notice is that we identify this as a mental health friendly work cultures. And we do this in part because it's not just about supporting those with psychiatric disabilities, but it's about creating an environment that's really good for everyone's mental health. And what we found this to be true, as I just mentioned with text messaging, creating a mental health friendly workplace is going to be good for people with psychiatric disabilities, but it's also going to be good for everyone. Many of the strategies that we're talking about here are useful to everybody and are things that every business should implement because it is going to lead to that innovation, that creativity, those places where we all want to work. So in order to come up with this toolkit, we did a lot of work. We partnered with Georgetown University, and we started with the research because we wanted all of this to be founded and have a foundation in the research. So we looked at thousands of research studies and what interventions we know work within companies to create this mental health friendly workplace. And then we interviewed employers of all different sizes. We interviewed employers that only have 10 employees, and we interviewed businesses like Merck that are incredibly large. We also had a lot of conversations with employers who are leaders in this space. And I say all of this to say that what we're about to share with you, we know works and we know can really help businesses move forward in creating a mental health friendly workplace, and that this isn't something that we came up with. This was created by business on the ground for business, and we hope that you'll find that really useful. So, drum roll please, ladies and gentlemen, the 4 A's of the mental health friendly workplace: accommodation or awareness, accommodation, assistance, and access. Awareness, accommodation, assistance, and access. We love to say we want you guys to bring your A game. The 4 A's of a mental health friendly workplace. So under awareness, we're talking about building awareness around psychiatric disabilities and around creating that inclusive environment for folks, for everyone that really addresses mental health. Number 2, under accommodations, we're talking about providing accommodations to employees with psychiatric disabilities so they can be fully integrated and engage in the environment and give all that they've got to give. Assistance. We're specifically going to focus in on employee assistance programs, but also we're going to talk about some of the things that small businesses that may not have an employee assistance program can do. And then number 4, access, and that's ensuring access to treatment for everyone. So the first one, building awareness and supporting a culture. When we talk, we started with this one because we really know that we're fighting a lot of stigma. When somebody says PTSD or schizophrenia or an anxiety disorder, often these things can trigger some things in folks' minds that may not always be positive. So we've got to help managers understand, what are we talking about when we talk about building a mental health friendly workplace? We've got to build structures and programs that are really specific for your business, that are going to help your business move things forward, but that also create that inclusive environment for everyone. And so we want to help you take action on these things. We want to share with you other resources, because in our toolkit, we didn't want to recreate the wheel. So there's a great toolkit called the Working Well Toolkit, created by the Center for Workplace Mental Health in 2016. It's also just got some really great stuff in there around how to build awareness. I want to highlight one specific business, and this is the Cincinnati Children's Hospital Medical Center. The leadership of the hospital was acutely aware of the stress at working at their facility and how that can engage their employees, and they wanted to show that they care for and interact with children experiencing significant trauma and their families on a daily basis. And this can be really stressful, and so as a result, the hospital is committed to ensuring that the compassion that it provides for all of its patients is also extending to its staff. And I think that's really important, and something that all of the hospitals that are engaging on this should be thinking about as well. And so they came up with a number of different ideas and ways that they could do this, but it involves proactively creating opportunities for employees to talk about their emotions. Again, proactively creating opportunities for employees to talk about how they're feeling, what's going on in their lives, and how they can work together to address those things. So as part of this, the hospital developed a mobile cart, and they dubbed it the Code Lavender, which includes a variety of stress reductions tools, such as scented lavender, art supplies, books, water, meditation, massage guides. And so it may be that someone realizes, we are having a rough day. Things here at the hospital for this team we need a Code Lavender. And so they may call a Code Lavender 2 p.m. and the employees can come together, they can reflect, they can share on what's going on, they can have a little bit of time to relax. And again, this is one strategy, and I'm not saying that everyone should have a Code Lavender within their business. What's going to work for you within your business is maybe very different, but it's the same type of focus where we're trying to proactively create environments where employees can talk about what's going on in their lives, where they can reflect and share each other's burdens, but ultimately lead to some relaxation where you're associating your workplace with positive things. I personally love the smell of lavender, so anytime that I can get around lavender, I'm going to associate that place with positive feelings. Another thing that they do is the hospital participates in Schwartz Rounds, which is an industry program that provides a structured forum for staff, both clinical and non-clinical, to discuss emotional challenges of working in a hospital environment, and they encourage this through initiatives and through newsletters and by word of mouth. But again, it's the same kind of concept that we're giving a space and an opportunity for folks to come together, to build awareness around a particular topic, to talk about that topic, and then figure out how they can take action together to address that topic within their workplace.
So the second pillar of our ways to bring your A game to workplace mental health is to provide accommodations to employees. Now, accommodations are a little bit different than the other A's, and part of that is because they are actually required. And so the Americans with Disabilities Act actually requires that employers provide reasonable accommodations to employees with disabilities who need them. I'm sure that everyone on the phone is aware of those requirements, but the important thing to note here is that there are some really good best practices for ways that an organization can provide and respond to those accommodation requests and provide those accommodations, and so we'll talk about that a little bit here. Specifically, ODP funds the Job Accommodation Network. You can see it on your screen. You can find it online at askjan.org, Jan, J-A-N. JAN is the leading source of free, expert, and confidential guidance on workplace accommodations and disability employment issues. And what they do is that they work towards practical solutions to benefit both employers and employees. And they do that by helping people with disabilities enhance their employability skills. And it shows employers how to capitalize on the value and talent that people with disabilities add to the workplace. And so Jan really does work. People can call them and ask questions about, we have someone new on our team who's asked for this or that, and do you have recommendations and advice? And Jan can respond to those requests and really help you figure out how to best meet the needs of your employees, which is pretty exciting. Accommodations, as I've said, they benefit both the employer and the employee, and they can be used to ensure that people with mental health conditions are included and successful in the workplace. So some common accommodations are on your screen: flexible workplaces, leave schedules, breaks, scheduling, other policies. And so important to keep those in mind as some of the very many options that are available. And to give you an example, an illustration of what this might look like for a person, we'll talk about someone right now who has a mental health condition, who is a veteran with service-connected disabilities, including a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. His name is Ish Escobar. Mr. Escobar is an HR professional who manages something called Operation Impact. Impact stands for Injured Military Pursuing Assisted Career Transition. It's a defense contractor, Defense contractor Northrop Grumman operates this program, Operation Impact, and it is their outreach and recruitment program for wounded warriors. Prior to assuming this position, Mr. Escobar worked in a variety of other capacities for Northrop Grumman, most of which involved providing security services. Ish spent more than 7 years in the U.S. Army in various capacities, including infantry rifle squad leader. Today, he uses several workplace accommodations to ensure his success on the job. These include noise-canceling headphones and the ability to bring his service dog to work with him and to travel with him while on company travel.
Awesome. And I want to point out two things on both of these slides because I know that a lot of folks on the phone are recruiters, and I want to point out that when we're talking about building awareness in the first slide, that this isn't something that we need to do just when somebody comes on board, but that this is something that you as a recruiter can do when you're going out and talking and proactively searching for folks with disabilities that you want to engage, is finding ways in which you can build awareness about your company's commitment to the inclusion of people with psychiatric disabilities. And same way when we're talking about accommodations, as Melissa said, this is a requirement under law, and if you're out there recruiting, you may have a responsibility to ensure that a prospective applicant has access to the accommodations that they need, either to engage with you or to engage with through the interview process. So we really want to encourage you guys. And another thing that I want to mention is when you go out into the environment and you're talking about how you are a business that creates a mental health friendly workplace that's good for people with psychiatric disabilities, but again, it's also good for everybody, because everybody that you go out and are trying to recruit, one of the things they might ask is, what about flexible work schedules? What about my opportunity to leave? What about breaks? What if I have a family situation or I myself have a situation? Is there going to be flexibility within the business to support me so that I'm able to go take care of that or have the flexibility to give all that I can give at work? And if your answer to that is yes, it's going to help your recruitment, but it's also just going to be a place that we all want to work. Did you want to add to that, Melissa?
I would also just add that in today's economy, we know that unemployment is extremely low, which means that you all are competing with each other for a limited pool of applicants. And so making it clear that you have a reasonable accommodations process when you're out and doing recruitment events can help you stand out from the crowd, because you are proactively saying, we support people with disabilities in our workplace, we support people with mental health conditions in our workplace, and it can help give you a bit of an edge for those candidates who are ready to come to work.
Awesome. Love that. So our third pillar is assistance, offering assistance, and we want to highlight employee assistance programs. Employee assistance programs serve in a variety of ways in various different kinds of business to support both individual employees but also their families when they are experiencing personal difficulties. A great place to go for more resources about employee assistance programs is the International Employee Assistance Professionals Associations, EAPA. And I want to talk a little bit about an example of someone who's utilized an EAP program well, but I also want to recognize that you may be a small business and may think that you can't utilize an EAP or that this is something that only big businesses can afford, but we've seen that there are ways that small businesses can engage and create EAP programs. And so when we think about EAP programs, there is a real value in an individual employee when they're having a hard time, having the opportunity to call someone and say, hey, I'm going through an issue. I could use some support. I need someone to talk to or someone who can connect me with resources and opportunities. But there's also an opportunity to leverage that know-how, that knowledge of an EAP program to do some wider and some larger things. For example, DuPont, who has a long history and rich history of working with EAPs. In fact, I think they're regarded as one of the first to have corporate support programs. So reflecting this, DuPont has a number of internal initiatives focused on mental health and employees' well-being with a strong support on top-level leadership. And as an example of this, DuPont's global EAP team created and implemented an internal anti-stigma campaign called ICU. And they spelled it, like ICU, like you were going to the hospital, but it was meant to have, that dual meaning, ICU or ICU. And it's this, and the centerpiece of it is this animated video that helps you recognize signs of emotional distress in a colleague and encourage them to seek help. And so again, this is not only a poster that you put in the break room that says, if you need or you have an issue, call EAP. It's a real opportunity to engage in conversations and help people recognize, I'm having a really hard day, or I'm experiencing some trauma right now. Someone recently passed away, and this is really hard. We need to talk about this as an office, or I need some support with this individually, and helping the entire culture recognize those signs, recognize opportunities to support and to help and engage each other, but also recognizing opportunities to go out there and engage in EAP. Now, they do work with larger businesses, but it's important to note that there are strategies for small businesses can use to offer EAP services. For example, by multiple small businesses banding together, they could negotiate a good price with an EAP, and many EAP providers are capable of doing that because a small business may not always need a full-time person, but if you negotiate a price as a couple of small businesses or you engage with some individual providers for some specific times, you can still get some of those services. And business membership groups such as the Chamber of Commerce or trade associations may be able to assist you in this regard. And we actually believe that in the small business environment, this can be especially important because if you're a small business, it's going to really impact your productivity or absenteeism if you have even just one employee who isn't able to fully engage in the environment. So we believe that having these kinds of resources available to your employees ultimately is going to end up being a net benefit to you in the long run because you're going to be able to support your employees and create that mental health friendly workplace.
So we will transition to the fourth A of bringing your A game to a mentally health-friendly workplace, which is to ensure access to treatment. There are a few different ways that you can do this as a company, but before we even get into that, this is also an excellent recruitment tool. When you are out and meeting with people, you won't know if they have a mental health disability or they need mental health services, but given the data and what we've talked about, there's a decent chance that that person or their children or their family may need access to those kinds of services. So if your company is offering those, use them as a recruitment tool, talk about it, advertise it. Again, it might give you a little bit of an advantage in the recruiting arena. If your company offers a health insurance plan, the first thing you really need to do is look at that plan and make sure that it covers mental health services. There are some plans with really limited mental health services, so it's worth looking and making sure that what you have to offer is an industry meeting, common industry standards and really can support people. The second is, if your business does not offer a healthcare plan, you should think about whether or not it's possible to do that. And I will say that's a big ask, a big suggestion. But in 2018, the U.S. Department of Labor actually expanded access to affordable health coverage options for America's small businesses and their employees through something called an association health plan. These plans would allow small businesses to band together by geography or industry to obtain healthcare coverage as if they were a single larger employer. So much like Michael talking about how you can band together to offer employer assistance programs, you can do the same thing around health insurance, and this results in a better negotiating power with the health providers and greater economies of scale. There's more information about that in the Mental Health Toolkit itself when you go on the web, so you can feel free to read up on that, and there's some links in there that can help you if that's a direction that you want to go in. To give you an example of a company that really is going above and beyond either of those two suggestions, there's a global pharmaceutical company called Lundbeck. And this company engages in research and development and sale of different medications for psychiatric and neurological disorders with a focus on depression, schizophrenia, Alzheimer's, and Parkinson's diseases. They have offices in more than 50 countries, and they employ over 5,000 people. According to the company representatives, educating about and decreasing stigma associated with mental health are embedded in Lundbeck's 7 core corporate beliefs. And this applies not just externally, but also internally for its own employees. To reflect this, what the company does is that they provide medication for mental health conditions for their employees or their dependents at no cost when it's prescribed by a physician. So if you work at Lundbeck and you get a prescription from your physician, the prescription is filled for free for mental health coverage, mental health medications. That's really important and a huge, some mental health medications can be pricey, so it's a big benefit for employees. Again, if that's something your company offers, you should let people know that. All the benefits, in addition, all the benefits information that employees receive leading up to the open enrollment period in the company's health plan also prominently feature mental health messaging and talk about what's available. So Lundbeck is really going the extra mile to make sure its employees know what's available and that they have proper coverage. And so that's something that everyone should be thinking about, ways that you can do that for your companies as well.
Awesome. So today we've gone over some very high-level strategies that are contained within the Mental Health Toolkit. We didn't want to cover everything today because we want you to go onto the web and we want you to look at these strategies. We want you to engage in them. We want you to talk about your leadership with them. We want you to talk about it with your employees and find ways that you can further engage on this. This is by no means the end-all, be-all. These are the strategies that had research around them. What I'm excited about over the next let's say 5 years, is I want to see more and more businesses throughout the country engaging in proactive ways to create mental health friendly workplaces so that this toolkit is constantly being added to by new employers who are coming to the table and saying, this is what worked for us. This is how we're having success. And that's going to look different from company to company. We have some case studies online that we went out and interviewed a number of companies, and we wanted to post some of those so that you can see some examples both from small businesses and large businesses in different kinds of arenas. But I would love for all of these case studies to just continue to grow, because each one of your businesses is going to have very specific needs and different ways that you can address this. And we believe that by engaging in the 4 A's, by thinking about how to bring your A game to the mental health or to your workplace, that it's going to be a good structure by which you can start to figure out what works for your business. So again, the 4 A's: awareness, accommodation, assistance, access. Awareness, accommodation, assistance, access, and you can bring your A game and figure out what strategies you're going to implement on the ground to make a huge difference. And hopefully you'll either be doing this presentation or we'll be mentioning your awesome work as a business the next time that we do this presentation. You can also learn more on the resources that we've outlined here, and we encourage folks to go to those. And we have a second page of those because we did a lot of research in order to come up with these.
And I'll just flag that I believe Sarah is going to send out these links when she sends out the recording. So you don't need to rush to scribble everything down. You'll get more information in the actual links so that you can get to them easily.
Absolutely, absolutely. So with that being said, I think that we're probably close to time, but we'll take maybe a few questions, but then we're going to leave you guys to continue to engage in this work, but also feel free to look us up and shoot us an email at the Department of Labor's Office of Disability Employment Policy. We're excited to engage with you as businesses to support you as you continue to increase the employment of people with disabilities. And as I said, 3, 5, 10 years from now, this is going to be such common practice within every employer throughout the country that we're going to engage people with disabilities and people with psychiatric disabilities to such a great degree that it's going to lead to innovation and creativities that we can only dream of right now. And so I'm excited to see that future. I'm excited to build that future with all of you on the call here today. So Sarah, thank you for the opportunity. Thank you to Getting Hired for the opportunity to be here. And we'll take a few questions and then we'll let you guys go.
Great, and thank you so much for all this great information. Do have a couple of questions that I want to dive into. As we discussed, you never know who might have a mental health condition, as these are non-apparent. What is one thing, because I know we covered a lot of different examples, but if you could just boil it down to maybe 1 or 2 things that recruiters and hiring managers can do to proactively create a more inclusive candidate experience, whether that is being cautious of certain language that you're using or a particular accommodation to have ready, some of the other examples that you mentioned, like talking about certain benefits that the company offers. Just wanted to know if you could summarize that.
I think you just summarized it. That was great.
All right, perfect.
Yeah, no, I think that's phenomenal. I think when you're engaging folks as a recruiter, I think it's going to depend on the environment as to how you would engage them. But let's say that you're sending out an email for a recruiting event. In that side of that email, you should leave a little space, one sentence that says, if you need a reasonable accommodation, here's how to contact us. I think that that one sentence probably says more about you and your company than, all different kinds of things. I think when you go out there and you're doing your recruiting strategies, and you've heard all of this before, but including those of us with disabilities, both visible and non-visible, and oftentimes that means that you may have current employees talking about their experiences. But all of the things that you just mentioned, Sarah, I think are perfect examples. And I'm sure if we opened up the line, we would hear hundreds and hundreds of those examples of how folks are doing it. Melissa, you got anything you want to add?
Yeah, I would just generally say that, if you pick one thing and you start there, and that's where it is, that often that first step is the hardest one, but if you start there, so if it is inserting that sentence like Michael talked about, or if it is making sure that you have your reasonable accommodations policy on your recruiting table, right, whatever that might be, take that first step, because it's in the messaging. And so if I'm a person with a disability, with a mental health condition, and I see that, and I see that you're bringing it to your recruiting events, to me, that might signal, oh, this is a place that gets it, or this is a place that wants to get it, or this is a place that's trying to get it. And so it really just opens the door for more people to think that your company is being proactive. Absolutely. And I think that's just take that first step.
Absolutely. Great question. Thank you.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more with that, especially with the accommodation statement. That is one of the questions that we always like to challenge employers and recruiters, anyone in talent acquisition on. So I'll leave that as a question right now. And an action item and step is, do you know what your company's accommodation statement is, and do you know where to find it? A lot of times the answer is no, so that is going to be one piece of homework that we give to everybody on the line here. And then from there, like you said, Melissa, that's step one. So from there, can you incorporate that in your emails? Can you incorporate that into every step of the hiring process and the application process as well?
Yeah. If I can throw out one more strategy that
Sure.
You can't, and again, I think that it's important to remember that these strategies will need to be adapted based off of your company and based off of your company's needs, which is why we built a structure that's pretty flexible and will allow you to fill things in based off of the 4 A's. But one of the strategies that we've seen, especially for those of us who are experiencing anxiety disorders, is being really clear when you're recruiting what that process looks like. Because the unknown can add a ton of anxiety, not just for those of us with psychiatric disorders, but for everybody. And so if I'm showing up to a recruitment event and I have no idea what it's going to look like, I don't know if they're going to have me stand on stage and do cartwheels or whether I'm just going to walk up to a table. Having some descriptions of what that process is going to look like, having a description of the fact that there will be 3 interviewers on your panel. Some employers even go so far as to say, here are the questions so that you can think about them beforehand and be ready to answer them. You can't always do that, and it may not be a practice that works for you and your company, but it's something that we should strongly consider with the understanding of how can we accommodate folks in the best way possible? How can we create awareness in a way that allows folks to engage? How can we provide that assistance and that access? All of those things within that structure. But that's a strategy that we've seen a lot of recruiters play with and figure out what works best for them to reduce some of that anxiety that you may experience as a person with a psychiatric disability.
Absolutely. And we always like to say, if you are implementing some of those proactive accommodations per se for every candidate, then it's still equal opportunity. You're not playing favorites or having any favoritism towards any particular candidate. It's still the same experience for every single candidate. So I couldn't agree more.
Yeah. And the reality is there's also important, and one of the things that when I share that strategy that we hear employers say is, well, we want to know how they're going to react under stress. You know, I know veterans with PTSD that would rather have a good idea of what they're walking into and can handle the stress of what they're walking into with some knowledge about that situation, and can handle stress really well because of that. And so I just want to reflect on the fact that there may be a difference between being able to respond well under a stressful situation and saying it has to be unknown for us to gauge whether they can react well in those situations.
I think that's a great point. Thank you for calling that out. Second question that I just wanted to get to while we have the time is, we hear this scenario a lot, and I wanted to ask what your thoughts were. A scenario where an employee is struggling from a performance standpoint, and knowing the individual at least well enough to where you feel like they might have a mental health condition that could be the reason behind this. How do you recommend the manager or the colleague approaches the employee and have a conversation around this? Because I think a lot of times we are overly cautious on being sensitive, and we are uncomfortable in those scenarios if in our head we're thinking that they might have a mental health condition, or maybe it's not the most mentally healthy workplace, but at the same time it is something that they do want to address directly for the best interest of that employee.
Yeah. So I'm going to answer this question to some extent, but I want to start with, when you've got a question like this around accommodations or disability, and you're saying, who am I going to call? Who am I going to ask? That's what the Job Accommodation Network is there for. Job Accommodation Network, askjan.org. So if you got a question, who are you going to ask?
Jan.
Ask Jan. You've got to call and ask Jan. And you can say to them, I have an employee that I've been working with, and I think that they might have a psychiatric disability. I think that it might be affecting their performance, or I think that they're going through a really tough time and they may need some support. How can I talk to them about it? And Jan can sit there and go piece by piece, utilizing the law, but also thinking about the situation. They've got the experts on the ground who can walk you through that situation, because I'm very hesitant even today to make a broad generalization about how you should engage in that situation without knowing a lot of the details that may be surrounding that and where that situation sits. And so that's the first piece of advice that I would have for anybody is you need to call and ask Jan the best way to engage in that situation, because they're going to walk you through it, they're going to help you, and they're going to give you the advice that you need on the ground in that situation to help you understand it. I also want to come back to the 4 A's, because I do think that there's a time and a place where offering, for example, assistance, an employee assistance program, and saying, you know, you may want to think about contacting an EAP. I do want to throw out the principle of respecting a person's right to disclose or not disclose a disability. I know that for me, as a person with a psychiatric disability, there are times and places where I may not feel comfortable, even as open as I am about my disability, disclosing. And there's some really incredible research out there from Cornell University showing the power that managers have when it comes to disability self-identification and disclosure. And when an employee has a trusting relationship with their manager, the ability to disclose and willingness to disclose a disability cannot be overestimated or overdescribed. And in fact, an employee, what the research shows is that an employee is much more likely to disclose their disability to a manager that they trust than they are to disclose their disability to HR, which I think is a really interesting statistic and a really interesting piece of research. So I want to come to the point of saying it's about building that trust. It's about building that trust throughout the relationship, especially when you're trying to deal with a performance issue, because dealing with performance is not always easy. And having that trust, building that trust throughout the employee's life cycle, but also with all of the rest of the team, is going to be incredibly vital when it comes time for engaging on conversations like this, or engaging in a situation where a person's disability or need to disclose a disability may have an impact.
Those are all great points. And I appreciate, again, you sharing your story and sharing that information with us, because I think that's also step one, is sometimes creating a safe space for people to share that information. And you can do that by even sharing your own story, or sharing what connection that you have to disability or mental health in general, and just having it feel like a personal conversation, or personable conversation per se.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, absolutely.
And I know we only have a couple minutes left. One last question. We have seen mental health, and I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir right now, just the term mental health as almost a trending phrase. Mental healthy workplace, mental health environment, benefits, everything related to that. Have you also seen, or do you feel that there are certain mental health conditions that more people are identifying with than before, or certain ones that are more common per se? For example, just knowing that more and more people might be likely to identify with having anxiety, knowing that there's a spectrum to that like anything else, but that's just one example.
Yeah, I think that it is interesting, because I do think statistically we know that there's a greater prevalence of people being identified with psychiatric disabilities than in the past. I don't know that we really have more people with psychiatric disabilities. I think what we have are more people coming forward, seeking treatment, understanding maybe some of the things that they're going through. But I also do think within that there are certain diagnoses that have a greater stigma associated with them than others. I still think that having a psychiatric disability in general does still contain a lot of stigma. And so I think that part of what we've got to do is band together, not only as the disability community, but also those of us with psychiatric disabilities. I hate when I hear someone say, "Oh, well, you know, I have an anxiety disorder, but it's not like I have PTSD, or it's not like I'm schizophrenic or anything," and almost labeling that as some kind of hierarchy, or that, you know, those people, I'm okay, but these other ones aren't. And I think really identifying ourselves, and all of us, and that's why I started by talking, you know, very briefly about this concept of like-me bias, because if you say, well, those people with psychiatric disabilities are different from me, and you create that other, it's going to have an impact in the workplace. Whereas if we can all come together and realize people with disabilities and people with psychiatric disabilities are already a part of the workplace, and you're likely to experience a psychiatric disability throughout your lifetime at some point, it really can remove so much of that stigma and create an environment where we see each other as valuable and something that we can all contribute, and valuable even in part because of our disabilities as part of that diverse fabric that makes up the workplace.
Yeah, and I would just add that I think, you know, we don't know if there is a greater prevalence necessarily, like as in more people actually have mental health conditions, or if it is just a greater awareness, you know, as people have greater access to health care, as the stigma around certain mental health conditions has reduced, I think, you know, you end up at seeing greater awareness, and you see people more willing to say, oh, I should talk to somebody about that, right? And that's actually pretty exciting. So I think as we see people more willing to come forward and talk about it, that can only help reduce the stigma that's associated